on. I have 2 little ones at home. So if for some reason at some point you can't hear me, just give me a little wave. So as Sean said, my name is Alana Snyder, and I'm here today to share my maternal grandmother's Holocaust story with you all. A little bit about me before I jump into it. I was born and raised in Pikesville, Maryland, just a little ways down the road. I have 2 daughters and currently still live in Pikesville, left for college, left for a little bit after college and found my way back home. And I am a special education teacher with Baltimore County Public Schools. I work with their infants and toddlers program. And this passion of mine of sharing my grandmother's story came about 2 years ago. My mom used to do a lot with the Holocaust and remembering the Holocaust, and she's kind of, in a way, passed the torch to me. So, thank you all for being here and for letting me share this. It's really meaningful for me. All right, so this is the story of my grandma, Bernice Herron. She was born Bronislawa Bram. This is her pictured in the center with her mother and father on either side of her. My grandma is a Holocaust survivor with an incredible story that showcases her strength, her faith, and a lot of good luck. While I grew up learning about the Holocaust in school and always knowing that my grandma was a survivor, she never ever spoke openly about her experiences. Not to me, not to her kids, and certainly not to strangers like I'm doing now. In fact, my grandma's youngest daughter, who is my mom, had never even heard of the Holocaust until she stumbled upon a book on the topic in her public library at 16 years old. She went home and asked my grandma if she had ever even heard of such a thing. It wasn't until this moment that an enormous family secret was revealed, that both of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. But that was really it. No other information was given, no details, no names, no dates, no memories. Several years before my grandma died, my mom begged her to document her experiences. It wasn't easy to convince her, and she started and stopped many times over the course of multiple years, but she finally did it. She wrote it all down. I cherish my grandma's journal as a living, breathing document to remind myself and the rest of the world of what we must never, ever forget. Based on her own written words, this is my grandma's story. Bronislawa Bram was born in 1924 in Częstochowa, Poland, to Ruth and Stefan Bram. Her maternal grandparents, pictured here, owned a very successful chemical and paint business in town. The business was so successful, in fact, that above it, my grandma's grandfather owned all 7 apartments that he and 6 of his 8 children and their families lived in, always rent-free. On the left is a photograph from 1993 of the building that used to be my great-great-grandparents. My grandma and her parents lived in one of these apartments. She was an only child. My grandma has the fondest memories of a very close-knit family who all gathered together in her grandfather's home on Friday evenings for a meal to welcome Shabbat, the Jewish day of rest, and again for lunches on Saturdays after praying in shul, which is a Jewish house of worship. From the time she was 5 years old, my grandma was a very talented piano player, learning to play even before she could recite her ABCs. She fell in love with 2 things very early in her life: music and nature. Her dream as a young child was to own a farm and always experience the beauty of nature. When my grandma was 8 years old, she was attending a private school where she was the only Jewish student. One day at recess, one of her classmates yelled out to her, "Let the Jewess use the facility last." This was the first time my grandma could remember someone being cruel to her because of her Jewish religion. She went home devastated and refused to go back to school. She ended up switching to a private Jewish school where she was surrounded by students who had similar traditions and customs. By the middle of the 1930s, things began to deteriorate drastically. And in 1937, the Poles staged their first pogrom, an organized massacre of the Jews. While people marched in the streets screaming death to Jews, my grandma and her family hid in the basement of their building, listening as strangers tried to break down their doors. On September 1st, 1939, my 15-year-old grandma was awoken by airstrikes, gunshots, and explosions in the middle of the night. Germany had declared full-scale war. The electricity in my grandma's entire town was shut off, and the whole city went dark. This darkness lasted for the duration of the entire war. One day, over loudspeaker, the Germans announced for all of the Jews to leave everything they had and to come to the middle of town. This was the first selection that my grandma remembers, a ritual during which the Nazis would send you either left or right, which correlated to life or death. My grandma was one of about 200 Jews out of thousands to survive this first selection. She watched as many of the elderly, children, and disabled people were shot on the spot. She saw young babies being thrown against a wall, causing instant death to their delicate brains. My 17-year-old grandma, her mother Ruth, 2 cousins, and the other Jews who had been picked to live another day were sent to an old factory called Metallurgia, where they worked as slave laborers, and then to another factory called Hasag, which manufactured military weapons and equipment. Slave labor jobs were just forced labor. No one was compensated for any of the dangerous and difficult work that they were doing. In Hasag, my grandma stood working for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Twice a day, they received soup with a small slice of bread and black coffee. If you didn't have a dish, you couldn't eat, so my grandma kept very close watch of her bowl to avoid theft. On the bottom left is a picture of a bowl with the Hasag logo printed on it that was taken by a survivor when they were liberated. After some Jewish men had staged an uprising in the ghetto where the Jews were living, the Germans had my grandma and all of the other Jewish women line up and count off by tens. Every 10th woman was shot on the spot. My grandma's cousin was number 7, and grandma was number 8. Afterwards, my grandma had to assist in removing all of the corpses, many of whom were her friends. By 1943, the ghetto was being liquidated, and Hasag became my grandma's domicile as well as workplace. She slept on a 3-story high wooden barrack with a bit of straw serving as a mattress. On the top right here is a photograph of the lavatory barracks at Hasag. Lice ran rampant in Hasag due to the deplorable conditions. In the mornings, my grandma would go outside and see charred bodies on the electrified fences surrounding Hasag of those who had decided to commit suicide. Typhus fever was also widespread, and my grandma got very sick. She was delirious from such a high fever, but still had to attend roll calls twice daily, or else she would have been shot immediately. Roll calls were when Jews had to line up so that the Nazis could count and inspect them. In December 1944, at 19 years old, and after 2 years and 8 months in Hasag, my grandma's mother Ruth returned to the barracks from work, saying she had been laid off from her forced labor position. It was extremely dangerous to not have a work placement. A total of 500 women who had lost their jobs were rounded up to comprise a transport that was supposed to relocate them, but nobody knew what relocate even meant. My grandma, who still had her job placement in Hasag, was faced with a terrible decision. She decided she could never part with her mother, and despite her two surviving cousins begging her to stay, my grandma joined her mother, who tried desperately to send her back. This is how my grandma left her beloved hometown of Czestochowa forever, on a cattle car, destined for who knew where. My grandma later found out that 3 weeks after she left Hasag, her two cousins and the rest of the prisoners were liberated by the Red Army. On the bottom right is a photograph, also from 1993, of what used to be Hasag and is now another type of factory. Their cattle car ride lasted 7 days. When my grandma and her mother arrived, they saw a large sign that said Ravensbrück. Uniformed women received them, along with yelling, screaming, ferocious dogs, and heavy rubber sticks. My grandma was forced to walk 5 in a row for many miles until they reached the camp. Ravensbrück turned out to be the largest all-female concentration camp for 100,000 women, and it was just outside of Berlin, Germany. My grandma was forced into a cold shower and her hair was shaved. She was given a uniform with no underwear or socks, just wooden shoes. Next, she was given her number. In the camps, names were lost to numbers. 98237. Ruth, her mother, was 98238. But families were strictly forbidden in the camps, so my grandma and Ruth always acted as strangers. When my grandma entered her assigned barrack, she couldn't find anywhere to lay, so she and Ruth chose a spot on the wet floor. During that first night, a woman noticed them, and she explained that the wet floor was what the women used as a toilet. During her time in Ravensbrück, my grandma saw women murder each other over one raw potato or a single ration of bread. The women there were utterly desperate and very tough. My grandma was assigned to dig ditches, which you can see pictured on the bottom left. Her day started at 5 a.m. with roll call. The Nazis were constantly lining all of the prisoners up and counting them outside in the freezing cold. Despite the harsh conditions of the German winter, my grandma would roll around in the freezing cold snow just to relieve herself of the terrible lice that were eating her alive. It would only help her momentarily. One day during a selection in November 1944, my grandma's mom was picked to go left, death. My grandma immediately followed her, but was struck hard by an officer and told to go back. As her mother was taken away, some of the other women had to restrain my grandma. In this moment, without her mom, she felt she had nothing left to live for. My grandma was completely devastated to have lost her mother. She thought constantly about Ruth's greatest sacrifices in the camps, which had been that on a daily basis, she had offered my grandma her bread ration, saying that she wasn't hungry. Of course she was. She was starving. My grandma never touched Ruth's bread, but because she had offered it, my grandma knew that Ruth would want her to keep fighting to live. Ditch digging was a job that lasted over 15 hours a day. As my grandma's wooden shoes gave out, she worked and walked barefoot, which led to a kidney infection that nearly killed her. By February 1945, her position as ditch digger was terminated, and she was picked to instead remove corpses from the barracks and bring them to the crematorium, which is pictured here on the left. This was one of the most painful tasks of my grandma's entire life, mainly because of how young all of the women were. My grandma wrote in her journal, "Every young woman that I had the honor to handle on her final trip to her well-deserved eternity, my heart was full of prayers to the Almighty." While walking back from work one day, my grandma noticed a selection taking place. As she tried to reroute herself to avoid the danger, She was called over to fill the last spot on a transport. While the women were being recounted, my grandma secretly ripped off her camp insignia, an armband that identified her as a Jew. After doing this, a group of Polish women who were carrying a soup kettle nearby yelled out, "Jesus, she's ours, she isn't a Jew," and directed my grandma to help them with the kettle. In true Roman Catholic tradition, my grandma crossed herself. This selection, according to liberators, was destined for Auschwitz, one of the most notorious Nazi extermination camps, where over 1 million people were murdered. By this time, my grandma's mother had been gone for 3 months. Women were being recruited one evening for the next morning's duties to clean up a camp called Jugendlager. When my 23-year-old grandma entered Jugendlager, or youth camp, she found out that some women who had been picked out during selections in Ravensbrück were being sheltered there, awaiting their execution, since there was only one gas chamber and tens of thousands of people to be killed. The camp was so overcrowded and the conditions were so poor that the one gas chamber and crematorium simply couldn't keep up. The youth camp had several barracks packed to the brim with prisoners. On this particular day, Ravensbrück had been so busy disposing of skeletal corpses that the last group of women that were supposed to die that day were going to have to wait until morning. My grandma began running into each barrack screaming for her mother, "Mom, Mom," despite having worked so hard for so many months earlier to keep their mother-daughter relationship a secret. Many of the prisoners looked up at her, motionless, but she continued to run and yell until she had reached the very last barrack. She entered, out of breath, heart pounding, and near collapse. She yelled aloud for her mother, but received no response from anybody. In a far corner of the barrack was a group of older women who could no longer walk. It was here that my grandma spotted her beloved mother, who could hardly see nor hear. She hadn't been fed in weeks as she waited to die. The Nazis saw no point in feeding any of the Jews, let alone those that were awaiting execution. Ruth had been part of the group whose murder was postponed until morning. If the schedule hadn't changed, Ruth would have died a few hours before my grandma found her. It was uncommon for anyone to survive the camps, let alone a 50-year-old woman who had been selected for death 3 months prior. My grandma was somehow able to sneak her mom out of the barrack to return with her that evening to Ravensbrück. When the group was set to leave, all of the women were stopped because there was one extra prisoner in the group count. The entire group was stranded for over 3 hours as the guards counted and recounted over and over. A Polish woman motioned to some of the others that she knew who the extra prisoner was, and she was prepared to disclose Ruth's identity to the guards. My grandma promised her ration of bread the next morning if she kept their secret, and miraculously she agreed. The next day, my grandma kept her word. Early the next morning, another selection took place, and this time, my grandma and Ruth were both picked to die. My grandma thought, at least we'll die together, not being able to bear the thought of being separated from her mother again. Strangely, they weren't sent to the gas chamber, but were instead evacuated from Ravensbrück on cattle cars, or what my grandma referred to as death wagons. She had no idea where they were going. My grandma remembers the next 6 weeks as the most difficult part of her incarceration. Typhus struck in incredible numbers. My grandma was given 1 slice of moldy bread per day, which became smaller and smaller. Each morning, the train would stop to let my grandma and the other prisoners empty all of the dead bodies. Several thousand started the journey, but only 600 survived. The picture on the right is a cattle car similar to what my grandma described, but this one housed prisoners and corpses from a different camp. My grandma became extremely ill with typhus for a second time. She was completely delirious as she sat on the floor of the train. The prisoners were no longer being fed at all, and people became completely desperate. Some of the women discovered that even human flesh was edible, and they would attack, kill, and eat the weak. My grandma, being so gravely ill, was an easy target. Ruth frantically guarded my grandma, throwing off predators as they would attack. My grandma never knew where Ruth had mustered that strength. After several weeks on the train, my grandma could hear intermittent airstrikes outside as the trains kept rolling. At one point, my grandma was herded off of the train, and she could spot a few small trees. She and the other prisoners picked the trees bare within moments. My grandma remembered that she got 3 leaves, which she of course shared with her mom. She was then forced back onto the train, where they continued riding aimlessly, occasionally stopping at and being turned away from different camps due to overcrowding. After 6 weeks and what felt like an eternity, the train came to a full stop and the German guards got off first. My grandma got out of the cattle car. She saw buses and could hear a loudspeaker that announced in several different languages that the day was May 4th, 1945. She had reached Denmark, and the International Red Cross was now in charge. This is my grandma on the left, 4 days after liberation. She weighed 60 pounds, which is the same as an 8-year-old in the 50th percentile today. My grandma and Ruth were transported by bus to a nearby school where beds were set up with pillows, paper sheets, and blankets. She was offered food but had to be very careful when eating because her intestines and stomach were so shrunken from starvation. She only remained in Denmark for 4 days when large boats arrived to transport her and the other survivors to Sweden. It was a very solemn moment for my grandma as the boats harbored in the most southern part of Sweden. She could hear several different national anthems being sung by the crowds. As the boat docked, my grandma heard Hatikva being sung, an important song for Jews all over the world, and now the national anthem for Israel. My grandma's world caved in. She wrote, "I'd never believed in my wildest dreams that there would be a Jew left in this world to sing this most historic and dramatic song." Displaced persons camps were set up as a temporary living space for survivors. While in the DP camp in Sweden, my grandma remembers that she was treated with compassion, patience, tears, and understanding. She had her first hot bath in 6 years. She received a coat, compliments of the Swedish government. After being seen by a physician, my grandma was immediately transported to a hospital where she spent the next 3 months recovering. Finally, in August 1945, she was discharged from the hospital and reunited with her mom. She found out from Ruth that my grandma's uncle Robert, the only Ganswa child of 8 who had been in America since before the war, had found my grandma and Ruth on the Red Cross's list of survivors and registered them for possible immigration to America. And by the fall, the American Embassy in Stockholm contacted her about a possible quick entry into the United States. At this point, about 5 months had passed since liberation, and my grandma and Ruth were responsible for finding their own apartment. And since Stockholm had an enormous housing shortage, they found a refugee camp 30 minutes away that offered housing. It was at this refugee camp called Fagerjo that my grandma's mother was approached by a man who introduced himself as a fellow Czestochowa native by the name of Henryk Haranchik, and he remembered my grandma's family from home. Henryk's brother, Ichek, or later Ira, was introduced to my grandma on September 27, 1946, And because they had so much in common, they had stayed up all night talking. My grandma and Ira fell in love almost instantly, but within a week of meeting, my grandma's visa was approved for America. While Ruth was ready to set sail for the US, my grandma wasn't ready to leave Ira and the new life she had started to build in Sweden. She extended her visa to give her 6 more months there. On December 3rd, 1946, 3 days before my grandma's beloved mother left for America, Ira and my grandma became engaged. They were able to celebrate with a traditional Jewish meal of chopped liver, gefilte fish, soup, meat, and a cake. When my grandma's 6-month extension on her visa was up, she sailed to America by herself with a total of $2 in her pocket. On June 30th, 1947, from the upper deck of the boat, the Gripsholm, my grandma could see the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island. Her mom and her Uncle Robert were waiting for her. My grandma worked in America for 20 months to save up enough money to return to Sweden and marry my grandfather in 1949. On the bottom left here, you can see their wedding invitation, the left side in English and the right side in Swedish, and on the right is their wedding photo. My grandma then returned to America, and my grandfather continued waiting for his visa approval for America in Canada, where my grandma traveled back and forth 16 times to visit him there. Finally, in 1951, my grandfather's visa arrived, and he was able to immigrate to America, where together they purchased a 3-bedroom furnished apartment in Queens, New York, with a $460 gift from Grandma's Uncle Robert. My grandma, grandfather, and Ruth all lived together here for several years. This is where my Aunt Isabel and my mother, Heller, were both born. Education was of the utmost importance to both of my grandparents, and so for the rest of their lives, every penny that they earned was saved for higher education from my mom and my aunt. Here you can see some family photos from my grandma's time in Queens. My mom is the baby, and my Aunt Isabel is the other older little girl. On the right is my grandma's naturalization paper from 1954. In 1961, my grandma and her family moved out of New York to a small rural town called Lewistown, Pennsylvania, population 9,300. By this time, my grandfather was the vice president of a large international firm called Fisher Electronics, and he was able to move the company to a new place. 6 years later, they purchased the house where my grandma lived until she was almost 90 years old. And in 1973, my grandma's childhood dream of owning a farm came true when they purchased over 150 acres of land close to their home. The top photo is a landscape of some of their land. Next to it is my grandma with Nanny, their first goat. On the bottom left is my mom on their farm with her dog Sammy. And the bottom right is my grandparents on Hollow Farm with my mom's first horse, Marwee. My grandma and her mother lived together until Ruth died in 1976. In 1985, before I was born, my grandfather died at the age of 65. My grandma wrote, "In 1976, I've lost my sacred mother. And in 1985, my sacred husband expired, and with their passing, I've lost the closest ties and bonds with the old world, which forever will remain a great part of me." But their departure was humane. They weren't shoveled into ovens or crematoriums in subhuman circumstances and conditions, the way the rest of my entire family was compelled to exit this world. I'm privileged to visit their graves at the local cemetery with peace of mind, knowing and forever treasuring them, being a great part of me as I am a great part of them. On the left is a picture of my grandma's mom with her 2 grandchildren, my mom and my aunt. In the middle are my grandparents on their 25th wedding anniversary. And on the right are my grandparents celebrating at my aunt and uncle's wedding a few years before my grandfather passed away. The house in Lewistown that my mom grew up in is the house and the town where all of my precious memories of my grandma lie. Here are some pictures of my grandma with all 7 of her grandchildren, mostly of all of us out in nature or at her favorite park called Greenwood Furnace. My grandma was adamant that each day of her life was a gift. Her refrigerator was always overstocked, and she encouraged her family, myself included, to eat a lot always. She insisted on having dessert with every meal, even breakfast, probably a result of having been starved for so many years. Looking back, I think about how clean my grandma's house always was. Spotless. I'm sure this was a direct result of having been forced to live in such deplorable conditions during the war. My grandma died in 2015 at the age of 91. While it was so tragic to feel her loss, I cling to the fact that she always says she was gifted 70 extra years, having survived an experience that was truly unsurvivable. While my grandma never spoke openly about her experiences during the Holocaust, she did always note the anniversaries of when she arrived in America, and she always encouraged me to marry a nice Jewish boy. In 2017, I married the most wonderful Jewish man, and I'm so proud to present my family's 4th generation of survivors, my daughters, Kenzie and Avery, and my twin sister's son, Brooks. And there's actually a fourth generation who is 2 weeks old. I need to add her. Brooks, 2 of the 3 are named in honor of my grandma. Brooks is a B name for Bernice, and Kenzie, my daughter, her Hebrew name is Tikva Lior, which means light of hope, and is a tribute to the unforgettable moment that my grandma experienced when she arrived in Sweden after liberation and heard Hatikva being sung. The picture on the right is from last summer of my mom, my nephew, and my oldest daughter at Greenwood Furnace, where I have so many cherished memories with my grandma. As we continue to face a particularly challenging time in history, I think often of my grandma, and I'm always reassured that I am strong because I'm the grandchild of a survivor. And for this, I'm forever thankful to my beautiful grandma. Thank you all.
Yes, are there any questions? Anything?
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to comment. My husband and I have actually heard from your grandmother's generation in another location. And I'm sure your grandmother would be so proud of you.
Yeah.
I know she would be. Even though she didn't speak openly about it. She died in 2015, so I was 25. So I feel like if she had lived 5 years longer, I would have been at an age where, maybe we would have been able to connect more about it. My mom swears that, because I said, I wish I had asked my grandma more questions. I wish I had pushed her more to ask her things. And my mom said, she didn't want to talk about it, but that, even though she didn't want to be public about her story, the fact that she wrote it down so that we would have it, makes my mom confident that she would be thrilled with this. So, yeah, it's been very meaningful for me.
Thank you for sharing your history with us.
Yeah, thank you all for listening and being here. It's, I remember when my grandma died, one of the first things I thought of was, one less survivor on Earth, right? And now 2021, it's like every day it's less and less. COVID has, there are a lot of survivors that went through so much, and now they're in an age group where COVID is really dangerous for them, and soon there won't be any more survivors. So it's important, to keep their stories alive.
Where else do you share your grandmother's story? And do you get out to younger generations that I fear don't hear this anymore in school, as things are changing or what kids are learning and being taught?
Yeah, so typically I share in classrooms. I've shared as young as fifth graders and up through high school. I change the story a little bit depending on the age group. It's been pretty upsetting to face a lot of roadblocks in terms of curriculum and what schools were allowed to share in the public school system. It's really difficult to get approval. I've had some teachers who are like, I don't care, like come anyway, especially with virtual learning. Like I'm not, like walking through the halls or checking in. So they've just sort of done it. I had an experience maybe 3 months ago sharing with some high school students in Howard County actually. And after I shared, the teacher was, we were chatting afterwards and he said, thank you so much. I didn't want to say anything prior, but I have a few students in my classroom who are Holocaust deniers. So I thought it was like really important, that you share the story, which was, really affected me. So yes, mostly schools. And typically like middle high school age.
How do you respond to those people that say that you didn't have?
I haven't, again, that teacher said it after when all the students were off the screen, they had left. So I haven't, I haven't been confronted with it like face to face. The evidence is there. The stories, the physical evidence, if you go to Europe, it's all there. So I feel like if it's a person who's saying it didn't happen, it's their own issue, right? Like it's their own thing they're going through. It's, how they were raised. And the most I can do is share what I know. And then, the rest is just, I feel like not worth getting into with them. But science, history, and, people's experiences, we can't argue with that. Yeah.
Just a brief history. I'm named after my great-grandfather died in the Holocaust. My dad was a soldier. He just died a couple years ago. He was able to liberate the concentration camps. And he almost never talked about his experience. So the Jewish people. But it's something that he just kept quiet about. I guess it was just so private. Things came out now and then, but he was 18, 19 years old, so it's something to observe for him.
Yeah. My grandfather, we know barely anything about, like a few things, a couple details, but he never spoke about it. He also died very young. My mom feels like, so he had a heart attack when he was around, like in his early 50s, and survived, but I think it was a very humbling experience for him. And he had never gone back to Poland or Częstochowa, where he was from, but after he had a heart attack, he said, I want to go back. I want to see my hometown. And within, I think, a month or two, he had another heart attack and didn't survive. So my mom has always felt like if he had survived, he might have opened up more. That also was, he died before the Shoah Foundation started doing interviews and archiving all of that. So, yeah, I know there are definitely survivors who it's meaningful and therapeutic for them to share. And I know tons of survivors who have never shared and don't have an interest in sharing.
My dad said there was never real hatred between the American and German soldiers. It was more towards the Japanese side. But into the camps it changed. The American soldiers became very, very, very good. And for that, my dad had never ever bought a German car. I respect what he saw, I respect his comments. He said he forgave the German people. They just couldn't become
Yeah. Yeah, my parents have never bought a German car. They won't, that's same, they just, didn't feel great. Yeah.
When my children were small, they were really ashamed because one was so young, since died. But when they were small, there was a man that worked with my husband. And I would pick up Doug at work. I would leave them along with, children out. So it was Christmas time, and he asked my husband if he could bring the children, because he was alone. And he said he had a little gift for them, right? So I was went over. He lived on the same street as my parents, and the man who knew him. So Doug went over with my kids, so we're quite small at the time. And he had bought 2 dolls, one of them was brown hair, which is my daughter, Alana, and the other one was red hair. And he gave it to Doug, and he said, yes, my children might get 10, and they wanted to really lost. And he always had this tenderness about him, and I couldn't understand it, because once I asked him, I said, do you ever feel bitterness or whatnot? And he said, no, because it was me, it was just, it was so poignant.
Yeah, it's incredible. And again, everyone, processed things or didn't process things in their own ways. But, I'm glad that he, was able. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah.
My mother and father, I was here in 1962. We lived out at one Heights. My mother was an elementary teacher in Old City Elementary, first grade. And I was a little girl when I met, probably third grade, in my year. My father was a doctor at Cable Manor at the time. So I went up to eat, play with a little girl named Mia. And so I was a doctor there. And I can, to this day, I remember her mother with white glass, long sleeve, giving us soup, and the number showed up for us. And I was a 7 or 8-year-old child, and I said, what's that? And Mrs. Clark, was the last name, said there was a war, but everything is good now. And, I'm a lot older, but to this day, I've always had the interest in it, because she did not show bitterness or anything. I never knew what happened to, her family. But as a child, I was exposed to it. And then on the other side of my family was Norwegian, and my great aunties of resistance. Because there wasn't a lot of Jewish people there that did that. Norwegian people were different, a bit different. So I got the interest, and I can't get enough of it. So that I tell my kids about it, because you're right, I think the ones now have the generational thoughts.
Yeah.
If you see somebody with that number as a child, it was such a promise.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Let's go here.
I just want to say, I think you're a very brave woman.
Oh, thank you.
You need to share your family story with anyone here who will listen, especially today when
children today are autism involved, and so many people deny it happened from their permanent.
Yeah.
And you're very.
Thank you. Thank you.
I suggest people who deny that Holocaust, this is the Holocaust. It is the Holocaust.
You mentioned the Show Foundation. Did you or your family memorialize or save your grandmother's journal, or has that been shared with them, or just to keep her history going?
You know, it hasn't. I need to. She didn't finish it. She worked for years because she would start and stop, and she would say like, "I'm not doing this," and you know, so she didn't end up finishing until really just before she died, and until I sort of took an interest a couple years back. Like my mom only had the journal, and at one point, like I had borrowed it, you know, to read, and like my sister, my brothers, and at one point I was like, "Oh, you know, can I get my hands on grandma's journal?" And she was like, "Oh, your brother has it." And my brother was like, "I don't have it." And I was like, "Mom, you need to," like the first thing I did, I like, you know, she had it, it was at her house. So, like I took it and I like scanned it. I was like reading and like emailing at different places to make sure that we have it. But no, I should contact them. I know a lot of what they did was the interviews, which of course, you know, my grandma had no interest in, but yeah, I should, you know, find a spot for it somewhere outside of the family.
The museum director's telling me yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you
As,
all.
you know, today's lecture kind of exhibits, you know, all the different medium that we as historians and history lovers, how we all process this. And this just goes to show how the oral tradition is very, very important in historical documentation. You know, the fact that your grandmother's stories were passed down, that you were here. You would be, you know, from the oral tradition, you are now in charge of those. You've got to make sure that those pass on in one way or another to the next generation. So someone 20 years from now can tell these same stories, or at the very least, her journal is scanned.
Yeah, I'm like, which one is it gonna be?
Yeah.
Maybe both.
Pass that on. But yes, this was excellent, and
Thank you.
thank you everyone for coming today. I'll be around if anybody has any questions about the bus tour tomorrow. I got an answer for you, or any of the future programs. But thank you very much for coming. We didn't do cookies today because we're all working on distributing cookies right now, so it's being nice. Yes.
You too, thanks. They have been interviewing
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I joined this third generation group like a couple months,
Do you
like
have a
February
summer purpose?
2020, and then COVID happened.
That's good.
So I feel like I've like
I just
been,
want to.
like
There we go.
immersed in it, you know, in my own sort of home.